So basically, my work looks at making meaning matter for literacy achievement. And it's kind of guided by reports that have come out recently showing the challenges that many U.S. students have in literacy achievement. So this is a statement from the Carnegie Council on Advancing Adolescent Literacy. And it reads, overall, we are failing to create a highly literate, college and career-ready adults with the literacy skill sets that qualify them for employment in the new global knowledge economy. While that's frightening, I think the more frightening piece to me is that, we start out pretty good in grade 4. We lose a lot of ground by grade 8. And by grade 10, according to this report, U.S. students score among the lowest in the world. So these reading challenges really are the foundation for my research agenda. So my research agenda looks at trying to improve literacy through morphological awareness. One of the really exciting pieces of being at Peabody is we're all taking on this literacy challenge from different aspects. And so I look at this very specific language level piece involving the system of morphology. And specifically, I try to answer 3 main questions. Basically, what is this construct of morphological awareness? It's relatively new. We know a lot about phonological awareness, phonological recoding, a lot of its related cousins, but we don't know a ton about morphological awareness, and researchers define it in many different ways. So one of my big objectives is to kind of clarify this a bit. The next piece is I look at how does morphological awareness contribute to literacy for different students. And so some of this work involves English language learners. Some of this work involves different developmental levels, elementary versus middle school. And so from here, I kind of think about this in the cognitive processing framework. And so following in the footsteps of Stanovich and Perfetti and Chomsky, et cetera, I think about how morphological awareness may improve the way that students process language. So for example, if I know the word fright and I know the word full, I might be able to use that knowledge to support my reading of a text that involves the word frightful. So basically it's a processing model. And then my third question that I'm kind of interested in answering is, all right, so if this contributes, should we teach it? Does it work to teach it? And also, what types of morphological awareness are effective? And from here, it's kind of a combination of these 2 frameworks, but mostly looking at it from a Vygotskian framework, thinking about what kind of educational experiences can we give these students in order to support their learning. So before we go much farther on, we need to actually come up with a consistent thinking behind what are morphemes and what's morphological awareness. So morphemes, you probably know them as roots and affixes. They're units of meaning that can stand alone or are bound to other morphemes. They have a lot of different functions. So sometimes they change the grammatical category, as in help to helpful. Sometimes they change the number, sometimes the degree. Sometimes they carry lexical knowledge, in the case of untrue, changing the meaning completely, not true, or syntactic knowledge. They're organized in layers so that they, for example, untruthful is un plus truthful, not untrue full. So they're organized in layers. And I think most importantly for my work, they're really important in English. So English is a morphophonemic orthography. And what that means is that we privilege the spelling of the root over those one-to-one sound symbol correspondences. You hear kids and adults who are learning English all the time say how confusing of a language it is. Well, part of the reason why it's so confusing when we're reading is because of the morphology piece. We, for example, in misspelled versus missile, this break here is due to the morpheme miss, and the other morpheme spelled. And in missile, it's a monomorphemic word, so the SS is pronounced as one sound. Same thing, in arrive and detective, you notice that they both have IVE in them, but because in detective, IVE is playing a derivational suffix role, it's pronounced differently than when it's pronounced in the monomorphemic word. So anyways, we privilege these relationships, and so to me, it seems like that it would be important for students to be aware of this. Also, one of the reasons why I'm interested in it is earlier research has showed its role in decoding vocabulary knowledge, reading comprehension, as well as spelling, writing, etc. So it plays an important role. How it plays an important role, we don't quite know yet, and that's part of my research. So morphological awareness in the literature is thought about basically in these 3 different ways. So most people seem to define it as this conscious awareness of the morphemic structure of words and their ability to reflect on and manipulate that structure. So in there's this analysis and this conscious piece, this purpose. Other people define it as morphological processing, where there's less conscious or implicit processing of morphological information. So it's kind of, we have the information, we use it, but we don't use it purposefully, we don't know we're using it. And so there's less of that analysis and conscious piece between processing and awareness. And then they have this like catch-all term called morphological knowledge. And it's not really defined very well in the literature. It's basically any knowledge that we use to help us determine morphological relationships. So one of my big goals, and we're going to start by looking at some completed research I have, is to clarify what is morphological awareness. So my dissertation started this, and I thought about how to create a theoretically pure construct of morphological awareness. One of the complexities is that morphology is related closely to phonology and orthography. So, for example, there's certain relationships like heal and health that are hidden by sound. So heal and health, the heal and health doesn't sound the same. And so there's some phonological components that are going into that. So what I did was I took a task. We adapted it from Carlisle's 1988 measure, and we administered it to about 200 English language learners. And instead of using the sum score, we looked at the items, and we classified them into being phonologically complex, orthographically complex, just morphologically complex, or phonologically, orthographically, and morphologically complex. So for example, in this you can see that from wide to width, both the spelling and the sound and the morphology is changing. So we classified it into these different subtests, and we used structural equation modeling and latent variables in order to get at that theoretically pure construct. So what we did was we looked for the overlap, and the overlap of those tasks are all morphological in nature, and so that went into the morphological awareness latent variable. And then the unique pieces theoretically go into the error terms. So basically the unique pieces went out into the error terms, and we were able to use that to predict in our model. Now that I've kind of thought about it in terms of those linguistic relationships, I'm really interested in taking it to the next level. So I'm currently just finishing up a study with 370 7th and 8th graders here in Tennessee. And I had the privilege of getting to administer 70 morphological items, which is so exciting, with an N of 370. So what I'm interested in is those morphological items have different relationships. So some of them involve analysis. Some of them involve more of that knowledge piece. Some of them involve highly frequent roots. Some of them involve less frequent roots. Some of them involve pseudo words. Some of them are real. Some of them have those different transparency issues. So I'm interested in looking at factor analysis and looking at how these items are similar and different, and really kind of trying to get an idea of what do these tasks actually assess and what really is morphological awareness. So to be continued, exciting stuff. And that leads in, now that we kind of have thought about morphological awareness, it leads into my second research goal, which is what is this relationship between morphological awareness for different groups of students, for English language learners, for different ages, etc. And like I said before, my dissertation involved English language learners, and so we used that theoretically pure construct of morphological awareness to predict oral vocabulary and reading outcomes, controlling for a kind of like the World Series predictor of reading, which is phonological recoding. We used phonological recoding because it's similar to phonological awareness, except we had fourth graders. And phonological awareness tends to ceiling out around second, third grade, and so based on recommendations of a few different researchers, we used a phonological recoding, which is basically a pseudo-word task. And so the long and the short of it, in 15 minutes or less, well, to put it in, is that we found some really interesting stuff. First of all, we found that morphological awareness significantly predicted oral vocabulary, but it did not predict these reading outcomes directly. It gets way more interesting, though, when you look at the total contribution. So morphological awareness did make a significant and meaningful contribution to both reading vocabulary and passage comprehension, although not to word decoding. When you looked at phonological recoding, the only path that was significant when you considered the total contribution was to word decoding. It was not a significant predictor of the others. So basically from this, we found out that morphological awareness had a significant and meaningful contribution to oral vocabulary for English language learners, specifically at 4th grade. And we also figured out that it makes a significant and meaningful contribution to passage comprehension and reading vocabulary. And it was really interesting to us that phonological recoding did not. So that leads to my current research, which, again, is with this middle school population. These are fluent English speakers, so it's a different population entirely, both in age and in language. And so we have a lot of really exciting measures. We've got the reading measures that we want as well, but we also have spelling measures. We also have word level measures, so we were able to administer general vocabulary, but we were also able to administer specific vocabulary, so vocabulary of derived words and then vocabulary of that root of the related derived words. And it's going to lead to some very exciting and interesting analyses. So the first piece that I'm planning on doing is using multi-level structural equation modeling to look at, first of all, are these relationships similar at this age and for these types of students? So does morphological awareness predict all these different measures of reading and spelling? And then, once we kind of get at that piece, we're going to look at the word level. So far, we haven't really done anything where we know that actually knowing the word magic would help you with the word magician. We know that generally, if you have knowledge of roots, it helps you with the general knowledge of the derived words, but we haven't been able to get to that word level feature. And so here I'm working with Don Compton and his graduate student Jenny, and we're going to be doing some IRT modeling to look at the differences between those relationships and to see whether actually knowing the root helps you in spelling the word, helps you in decoding the derived word, and helps you in figuring out the meaning of the derived word. So again, to be continued, but really exciting stuff. At least I'm excited about it. And my future research path is, so we now know a lot about it at the 4th grade ELL level. We know about it at the middle school level. I want to know about it a little bit earlier on, and I also want to be able to compare English language learners with fluent English students within the same data set. And my dissertation data only has English language learners in it. So we can't compare any kind of multiple group analysis. So luckily Peabody funded my small research grant. So I'm going to be going out and collecting data from 2nd and 4th grade fluent English students. And the goal of this is I'll be able to look at the differences between 2nd and 4th graders, but they're going to be the same measures as what I have for my dissertation. So I'm also going to be able to look at the difference between 4th grade English language learners and these 4th grade fluent English students. So should be interesting again. And for that I'm using multiple group structural equation modeling. And so now that we're learning a lot about these underlying relationships, my next piece of work talks about instruction. So should we actually teach this and how? And so a lot of my work on should we teach this has taken the form of meta-analyses. So I have 2 meta-analyses out. There's one that's under review currently, and there's one that's actually out and published in Annals. And so basically, the difference between these 2 pieces is that here we look just at students who had literacy difficulties. It was our first piece. And then we expanded it, once we had kind of good findings, we expanded it to include all school-age children, regardless of whether they had any kind of literacy difficulties, period. And as you look at this very confusing, very wordy slide, the message to take away from it is that morphological instruction does seem to work. All right, you have a general, not randomly, but pretty impressively, these 2 studies both found an overall effect of 0.33, which is moderate and meaningful. When we looked at moderator analyses, we found that morphological instruction had a significant effect on a lot of the components of reading. It was very similar across studies. The only difference was in this general student population, it was significant on decoding but not on comprehension. And in this more specific students with literacy difficulties, it was significant on comprehension but not on decoding. So the take-home message to this is that it does seem like morphological instruction works. But both these analyses and there's 3 other syntheses out in the literature as of 2009 and 2010, and all of them comment on how, while we are getting the sense that it works, we don't know what works about it, because the way that studies report their instructional strategies is that there'll be like a group of strategies that they use. And that group of strategies is not the same as the other group of strategies. They've got like one that's an overlap. And the problem is that you can't untangle them because of that overlap. And so this is leading into, oh, actually, that would be skipping. But anyway, so this leads a little bit into my current research where I'm working with Aline Harris on checking out a specific morphological instruction. She has a morphological intervention in Williamson County schools, and it's been adopted by 9 different schools, and there's never been any research on it. So we decided to collect research and try to see if it works. And so we have all these great measures, and we're going to be controlling for their earlier TCAP scores and using multi-level modeling to determine whether that intervention is effective. So hopefully we can figure out that intervention is effective. And then the future research is the research that's trying to untangle these instructional strategies. So I'm hoping, I've kind of initially applied for a Spencer grant, but we'll see what happens with that. But even if the Spencer grant doesn't come through, I want to do 4 very small-scale experiments to look at which of these instructional strategies seem to work. So we have all these, like, lots of them together, but I'm going to try to isolate them. And so I'm hoping to work with 4th and 7th graders, and I'm hoping to keep it within teacher. So, for example, at 7th grade, it's pretty easy. Teachers have, 140 kids, et cetera. So within that teacher, I'm going to randomly assign students to different instructional conditions that answer the following 4 questions. So we're going to look at, should instruction focus on knowledge or analysis? So trying to get at that morphological knowledge versus morphological awareness piece. Is building or breaking apart words most effective? And that was what we found from the meta-analyses and syntheses that was the most often morphological strategy used. People either break down words or people build words. So trying to look at which of those is most effective. Should instruction involve connected text or simply memorization of definitions? And so again, the research is kind of split on that when you look at it. And about how much time, instructional time per morpheme is ideal. And for that, that's what the teacher is talking. They want to know, all right, how much time should I spend on this? Some of them teach all 12 morphemes, and they teach them like bing, bang, boom, 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 and memorize them. The other ones say 12 is way too much. I'm only going to pull out 3, and I'm going to teach 3 really well. So all of these are going to be in 20-minute conditions where the students will be pre-tested before condition, instructed for 20 minutes, and then post-tested immediately, and then we're also planning on post-testing them about 2 weeks later. So that's pretty much the big picture. So my dissertation ended with some of the most important correspondences between spoken and written language are at the level of the morpheme. The system of morphemes, therefore, is a powerful resource for those learning literacy. Great statement, but to me, my research kind of tries to figure out, but what about morphology is it? What really is morphological awareness, and how do we measure it? We have an IRT model as well. Then we're trying to figure out what components of literacy does morphological awareness support for whom. And lastly, how do we actually teach it? And right now, I'm looking at kind of the student level because my intervention has student outcomes, but eventually I want to look at professional development. Once we kind of figure out what works, I want to take it to the teacher level as well. So that's pretty much it, and the goal is to improve literacy for all. And any questions? Yes? Me too.
Which direction are your measures going? I mean, is this just whether or not kids can parse words into morphemes? Is the analysis part? Is that the primary dimension of awareness?
Yeah, so like I said, it's kind of unknown. So there's a few different types of tasks that are used. One is the parsing apart of morphologically complex words. One is where you give them a morphologically complex word and you ask them to get the base. One is where you give them the base and you ask them to produce the derived word. Another one provides sentences, and there's a blank, and they provide, it's more of a syntactic piece, and so they provide 4 different options with different suffixes. A version of that also involves pseudo words. So I think that's what I want. So my measure has 70 items, which is awesome, and I was able to combine 3 different measures and then also add a 4th. And so I'm going to be able to look at these different relationships. So does knowledge of the link between 2 words, Is that more morphological knowledge, or is that more awareness? Does pulling words out, just the base out, is that similar to knowing that that they have a morphological root as well? And so I don't know the answer to that question. I've reread all of the morphological literature lately, just trying to figure out these and trying to figure out how people define it. And it's not consistent. And I think that that's one of the really big challenges in the field right now.
Is it possible there's a developmental sequence there that starts out with some low level of recognition and ends up with the ability to manipulate the morpheme?
I think it's possible, and I think it's possible that it's also based in instruction. So, I mean, anecdotally, you hear teachers who actually have morphological instruction in their elementary school classrooms talk about kids parsing words apart. And you don't see that, like you certainly didn't see that in my 4th grade classroom because we didn't do that. And my kids didn't look at those relationships. So I think that it's developmental, but I think there's also an environmental kind of social model around it. And the other piece is I'm not sure how much of this is morphology or a way of analyzing knowledge in general. So is it that analysis piece, and is my analysis limited to analyzing morphological relationships within words, or if I have that analysis piece, am I the type of person to analyze the various different types of knowledge that I come into? So I'm trying to figure out how to get at that learning level or that level of thinking versus morphology. And I'm not sure how to do that yet, but to be continued. Yes.
English language learners, is there a difference based on similarity of their first language to English?
Yes. So there's a definite difference based on the similarity and also based on exposure. So English language learners vary in their amount of exposure to both their native language and to English. And so if they haven't had exposure to these words in their native language, they're less able to recognize, for example, cognates in English. So there's definitely that component as well.
Time for one more question?
Yes.
So do you think you would develop much morphological knowledge only orally? Meaning, it seems to me like seeing it in print is what makes, even if your outcomes are oral, but that seeing it in print is where the analysis, and it's easier to notice, especially when there's not phonological match. I don't think you'd be less likely. So anyways, is your sense in the age of kids you're using is suggesting that print might have something to do with this, right? You're not working with 5-year-olds who have pretty good oral language skills and pretty much no print knowledge.
Well, I think there's a role for both.
Okay.
So, I mean, even as early as preschool, we see kids using derivational relationships, and they're pseudo ones. So they're not, it'll say it's flyable, or it's, and they're generalizing. So I think that piece does develop an oral language, and I think you hear kids trying to figure out similarities in oral language if they don't know a word.
Okay.
But I think when it gets tied to text comprehension, which is one of my pieces I'm most interested in, a lot of things come in. So it's that fact that we privilege that orthographic root. So even if you can't pronounce the word, even if you've never heard the word in your life, you might be able to recognize the root. And so I think it's different information, and so I think the relationship's a little bit different in oral versus text relationships. Very cool. Well, thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate it.
I should note that this presentation's more of at the macro level than Amanda's. She was giving quite a bit of detail. But hopefully there will be opportunities for you to ask about specific research projects. So that's what I basically just said. I'm also Associate Editor of Economics of Education Review. So 4 main research areas: school choice, things like charter schools, magnet programs, vouchers, school finance. I'll give some examples of that in a few minutes, but the incentives associated with different funding programs, basically. I've looked at accountability a little bit, specifically focusing on NCLB, and then the final area is gifted and tracking programs. So my research in school choice, charter schools, these have generally been evaluations funded by various organizations trying to know whether these programs are working or policies are working. So examine the effectiveness of charter schools measured by test scores. Something that we've done recently is extend that looking at graduation rates and college attendance, which is something new that most people haven't done in the past. I'll discuss that a little bit more in detail in a few minutes. We also looked at the issue of cream skimming and racial segregation in charter schools. So an important policy issue of charter schools is, are they taking the best students from traditional public schools, making it more challenging for traditional public schools to educate the rest of the students, and also is it creating a situation there's less diversity in these charter schools that the students attend. We also examined competitive effects of traditional public schools, so we did this in a couple different ways. We surveyed traditional public schools and looked at those schools that were near charter schools to see if they were changing anything in their operation as a result of charter schools being introduced. A major tenet of the charter school movement or school choice movement in general is the idea that there would be healthy competition and inspiring the traditional public schools to improve. So we did some work on that, and we also looked at test scores of traditional public schools to see if they improve once there's an introduction of charter schools. And then finally, we examined some of the funding of charter schools, which varies by state. But this is looking at their public funding, how they receive their funding with the mechanism, and also some of the private resources that go to charter schools, which have generally more private resources than traditional public schools. A second major area of my research has been magnet programs. And we're looking at various outcomes here, test score, behavioral outcomes. We're also thinking about looking at college attendance here as well. One of the things that was really interesting that I could just highlight for a second is, so this was using lottery designs. So oftentimes magnet programs are oversubscribed, and so some students get in and some students don't, just by chance through a lottery. And what we found is, people were trying to get into these programs, and of those students that won the lottery, about 95% of them ultimately attended a district school. This was in Pittsburgh. Of those who lost the lottery, only about 70% attended a district school. So you lost like 25% of the population, and it made it hard for our research design because you lose that balance between your treatment and control group. But one of the things that was interesting to us is that signaled that magnet programs are a good way to retain students, and that 25% that they lost were actually from very affluent neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. So it was the high-income families that they're retaining by using these magnet programs. So that was something that we didn't necessarily expect going in. We were hoping to have this clean research design in terms of a lottery analysis, but ultimately we got something else that was kind of interesting come out of it. So in terms of school finance, much of that work has been actually in Michigan. So one of the projects that was published in a paper was looking at centralized funding. In Michigan, like many states, moved towards greater funding at the state level rather than local levels. And they did this on the operational side, but they didn't necessarily do it on the capital side, meaning they didn't centralize the ability to get capital resources. That was still supported locally. And so what we found and they actually restricted high-income school districts from going and getting too much money. So that it centralized and it compressed the variance in terms of expenditures. Well, what a lot of the high-end spending districts did when they did this is just started issuing a lot more bonds. And what they used to call patching the roof as operational expenditures suddenly became capital expenditures. So this was a way of getting around the policy. And so there was something from 1994 where this policy was put into place, about 40 bonds per year that were issued across the state to about 190. So there was this huge spike, and immediately they found ways around the policy, basically, the high spending districts. So that's just one example. We also looked at what type of capital investments are more likely to gain support, voter support, things like new buildings versus maintenance, athletic fields, so on. Examine the relationship between capital expenditures and test scores. And then we also looked at, and this last one in Los Angeles was more of a qualitative study, looking at private resources in public schools, what types of private resources are contributed to public schools. And one of the things that was kind of interesting that came out of this is that corporations and so forth were more willing to give things like computers and in-kind types of resources rather than just pure money. So they wanted it targeted in some way. So that was in Los Angeles. Okay, to address these questions, I'm mainly a quantitative guy. I've participated in several projects that have mixed methods, so I have been part of some collection of qualitative data. But the quantitative methods I've used in these various projects are randomized designs, instrumental variable approaches, difference of differences, fixed effects, matching strategies. So a lot of experimental, quasi-experimental designs. Okay. These were published in a variety of outlets, some of them in economic journals, some policy, some education, book chapters, and then a fair amount also in think tanks because I was working at RAND for a number of years. And out of these, actually, my think tank publications have vastly got more cites than my journal articles. RAND does a very good job of getting attention to their publications. When you get a publication there, it's often in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times. Researchers see that, and you get a lot of citations. In terms of who supported the research, I've had federal support, IES, NCS, Department of Defense. Actually, I've done some work for Department of Defense in terms of looking at education for families that are on bases. Part of that was looking at these large bases are all federal property and it's not taxed. And these school districts have to provide education to these students. So the Department of Defense actually provides resources to these districts. It's called Impact Aid. And so we were trying to figure out what the appropriate amount of money is to go to these school districts per pupil. So while it was a Department of Defense study, I mean, it's a study that you could imagine that would fit into the scheme of interest to people that are interested in education policy in general. Some state-funded ones, California districts, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and then foundations, an array of foundations, some of them national like Bill and Melinda Gates, and some of them more local like the Joyce or William Penn Foundation and so on. So I'll just give you one example. It's just a few slides here of just basically the research question, how we approached it, and then some of the results. So this was work recently published in the Journal of Labor Economics, and it examined the relationship between charter high school attendance and the probability of graduating high school as well as attending college. So this was interesting because no one had really done this before. There has now been a lot of work looking at test score outcomes for charter schools of varying quality, but there is a fair amount of work. And so this was the first study that looked at some of these outcomes that we argue are probably more important than test scores. We probably care more about if you're going to college than we do how you did on your math scores, and I think parents would say that as well. And partially why this was the first study that did this is it's been hard often to get K-20 data, but in a couple different places we were able to do that, Chicago and Florida, so we were able to link all students in Chicago public schools if they went on to college through the National College Clearinghouse data. We did the same thing in Florida. Florida actually has a K-20 data system where you can track students that go into Florida colleges. But on top of that, we linked it to the National College Clearinghouse data as well, so if they went outside the state, we could see that as well. So obviously, a concern here is those who attend charter schools might be different from those who attend a traditional public school. They made a choice to go to these schools, and because they made that choice, they might be different. So the ideal way to do this would have been a lottery design where you use lottery data. We didn't have that. We would have had to go into every individual charter school to get that data, and how well they maintained that data would have been a question. So we did 3 different things. One, we used observable student characteristics prior to attending charter high schools, things like race, gender, free and reduced lunch status, and importantly, the prior test scores prior to getting into high school. So hopefully that captures some of that unobservable differences in terms of motivation and so forth. But on top of that, we used an approach that others have used in the Catholic high school literature, and we looked at students that were all in 8th grade in charter schools. And some of them go on to traditional public high schools, some of them go on to charter high schools, but they all at one time were in a charter school. And the main reason many of them end up in a charter high school and others in traditional public high schools is that there isn't a charter high school nearby to go. And so then we compared those populations. So our sense is all these families and the students actively chose to go to a charter school at some point. In some cases, they ended up choosing a charter high school, in others cases, a traditional public high school. The third thing we did was use an instrumental variable approach as a proximity to a charter high school as an instrument to control for their choice of going to a charter high school. Now, have we eliminated all the selection bias? I don't know. But I think it provides more suggestive evidence than just using OLS. And it ultimately resulted in some pretty provocative findings. Charter high school students were 7 to 15% more likely to graduate high school, and about 8 to 10% more likely to attend college, depending on location. What's interesting is that when you looked at their test score differences, like in 11th or 10th grade, depending on Florida or Chicago, their test scores difference were hardly different, though. They were about the same between those in charter high schools and traditional public high schools, but you had these pretty significant differences in graduating and going on to college. And even when we put them as a control variable, you still saw these differences in terms of graduation and college attendance. Now, there's some validity threats there. It might be that, for instance, charter schools see this as a marketing ploy to say, we have 97% of our students graduate, and what they would do is just pass everyone through and make their standards very easy. So that would be one threat to this. So one of the things we're doing right now to extend this is to see if the students get into college, for instance, are they staying into college? And that seemed like it would be a way to at least look at some of this issue if they're really capable of being in college once they graduate their high schools. So one of the things that this suggests to us is we need to broaden the scope beyond test scores and some of these, not only in school choice, but on lots of different evaluations. We hope that others will try to replicate these findings with experimental research designs. I think in order for people to be completely convinced of these results, they're going to have to be a little stronger in terms of their research designs. Nevertheless, we think they're provocative and worth pursuing in terms of further research. And like I said, we're currently extending our study. Joyce Foundation is funding us to look at whether they complete college. The reason we didn't do that in the original study is you have to wait quite a long time. You have to start with students in 8th grade and have to see them 5 years later whether they attend college. In order to see if they graduate college, you have to wait 8 or 9 years, and the charter schools just weren't old enough, really, to see that long of a time frame. But now, our study's a few years old, we could actually go back and look at those students to see if they graduate college. So that's it in terms of an overview of my research agenda. So most of it's been on school choice, but I've dabbled in some other areas as well. So, any questions?
Do you have any idea why someone attending a charter school might be more likely to attend college?
Well, there was an array of foundations that supported this. The biggest one was the Gates Foundation. And we actually, when we found this, we didn't really expect it going into the project. When we found this, we suggested to the Gates Foundation, can we go in and do some qualitative work to find out what's going on in these schools, or possibly survey the students as well, or teachers and so on. Anecdotally, what some people have told us is that these schools are smaller. They try to hire very good counselors and keep track of the students as they're going through to make sure they're on target for graduating. So they keep a very close eye. These high schools may only be 200 students, 300 students, as opposed to a lot of Chicago high schools that might be 2,000 students. And it's easier for those counselors to keep track of those students and make sure that they graduate. Because they are thinking about this as a way to effectively recruit students into their school, is to make sure that their students are doing well in terms of graduating. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's
Well,
where.
this suggests to me because the work on small high schools has some of the same kinds of findings as schools under 500. Interesting to compare these charter school rates with the small high school rates.
Yeah, Chicago actually had both going on at the same time. Some of it overlapped. Some of the
Some of those small high schools are really they just divided 2001 into 4 500 ones in the same
building.
location.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't count that.
So yeah, I mean, that would be interesting. We took some heart in our findings also that in the Catholic high school literature, these results aren't that dissimilar to those findings. And also, there was actually a recent study of DC's voucher experiment where they used randomized design and almost found identical results. And one of the things that was interesting, they didn't find any test score results either. So their graduation and college attendance was similar to what we had, and kind of the same story that you don't see any test score effects. So that gave us some encouragement in terms of saying we believe these results are valid. Now I'd like to have an experimental approach to do this, but nevertheless. Any other questions?
Have you looked at all like what kinds of colleges they're going to, whether it's selective versus highly selective, 2 year, 4 year?
Yeah, we'd like to do some of that. So we do know the institutions. We know if there are 2 or 4 years. The sample sizes get pretty small because we were only able to follow a couple cohorts. In this follow-up study, we could, I think, slice this in more fine-grained ways and look at those issues, whether it's 2 or 4 year, also the quality of the institution, whether it's a selective school or not. The other thing about the National Clearinghouse data allows you to look at credit accumulation, and so we might be able to look at some of that as well. But yeah, that's a good suggestion.
Do you see charter high schools moving? I know there's quite a few just in elementary, but my best friend is in Houston, Texas, and there's a lot of middle school discussion. And middle schools, and her son feedered into a traditional public high school with his peers because there wasn't a high school. So do you see the high schools more on the rise? Like, where is that piece of it?
Well, in Chicago, so let's see if I understand your question correctly. Chicago actually had a significant initiative to focus on high schools, and part of their initiative was actually introducing lots of charter high schools. And so it was an explicit policy there to focus more on getting the numbers of charter high schools increased there. One of the things interesting in Chicago, there are a fair number of charter high schools there that actually extend beyond the grades 9 through 12. They go like 6 through 12 or 7 through 12. And it may be that this is just a product of a different grade configuration. And so one of the things we did, in Chicago we couldn't do too much of this because the sample size wasn't that large, but in Florida you could see whether you saw differential effects for those who had a broader grade configuration than those that just had 9 through 12, and we didn't see a difference in terms of performance. Mark?
I haven't followed this literature very closely, but I have a sense that it's been stuck for a while on charter schools as a kind of categorical variable, charter versus non-charter.
Yeah.
And that kind of strikes me as something like gender differences. I mean, sex isn't a causal variable, it's a proxy for a bunch of other things. And surely charter school categorically is a proxy for other kinds of differences. And if there's any contrast between them, it seems to me we want to know what those differences are and what accounts for them. Is there movement in that direction? Are there any of your studies
Yeah, so there's a
boxes a little bit?
So I have 3 different studies that do a little bit of this. Not as probably as far as we need to go. But one tried to break it down into different types of charter schools. Things like conversion charter schools, those who convert from traditional public schools, startup charter schools, start from scratch. And then there's a fair amount in California, Ohio, and a couple other places of what's virtual schools or non-classroom based schools. These are home school charter schools. Some of them were quite large. California, there was one homeschool charter school that had 10,000 students, where students were as much as 500 miles away from the actual location. So they're doing all online. And we did find some differences among these different types of charter schools. And the one that was really lagging behind was the online charter schools. They had significantly worse achievement in terms of test scores. So we did some work on that front, but a couple other things we tried to do. One, we created an effect for every single charter school and every single traditional public schools in these different states, and to see if there was greater variance in charter schools and traditional public schools. And the theory is that you would see greater variance, right? They're allowed to experiment, and that's what we did find. Much higher variance in the charter schools. And one of the policies that could come out of that is if we can predict those schools that are going to perform poorly based on maybe their charter application, then to eliminate that before they even get a charter. Or just after the fact, the policymakers have been reluctant to cut off charters, even if they're performing poorly. And if you could cut off that bottom part of the distribution, you'd raise the mean performance of these schools. The third and final thing we did is we had surveys of charter schools and traditional public schools about their operation, funding, instructional practices, and so forth. And we tried to put in these survey responses into our achievement analysis and to see if we could tease anything out. Maybe our survey wasn't very good. We couldn't tease anything out other than parental involvement matters. And it's very hard to, you guys probably know better than me, it's hard to really get down at teaching practices just with a survey, especially if you only have 30 or 40 questions to ask. And so we weren't able to capture anything. But I think there needs to be further work in that way, and we actually suggested a more in-depth analysis to Gates to do that. And so it was actually part of one of these projects that they funded about $600,000, but the project was going to go to $5 million if we did that, and they stuck with the $600,000 option. And I figure if Gates isn't willing to do it, it's going to be hard-pressed to find any foundation to do it. IES might be able to do it, or NSF or something, but in terms of the foundations, they just weren't willing to do that. But I think that's exactly right. And I do think people have become tired of just looking at test scores for charter schools. It's mixed, and every study seems to suggest that, so I don't know if there's going to be much more just test scores. I'm hoping there is more other outcomes that we might look at.
Interesting analogy. Dale and others know more about this than I do. But the longitudinal studies of early childhood education don't show big achievement effects either. And most of the punch in those seems to be behavioral outcomes.
Right.
And it sounds like there may be an analogous thing going on here.
Yeah, I've kind of had this stirring in the back of my mind that with NCLB, there's such a focus on meeting certain targets that you can possibly, you can possibly meet those targets without necessarily achieving some of these other outcomes, or there would be greater variance in some of these other outcomes. You get compressed range of what people are doing in terms of meeting test score outcomes, and greater variance on these other outcome measures when it's not an accountability measure. Oh, sure, great.